The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren fields of Lucas's struggling farm. The wind carried a strange stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the old barn doors swinging lazily. It was on this eerily quiet evening that Lucas stumbled upon the plow. Hidden beneath a tattered tarp in the farthest corner of the barn, the object seemed to call to him, as if it had been waiting patiently for years to be discovered. His hand hesitated before pulling the tarp away, and when he finally did, a shiver ran through his body. The plow was unlike anything he had ever seen. Ancient, almost otherworldly, with wooden beams darkened as though soaked in shadow, and metal blades etched with strange, undecipherable runes. As Lucas examined the plow, the air grew heavier, colder, as if the barn itself were holding its breath. The light from his lantern flickered erratically, casting distorted shapes on the walls. He could swear that, in the silence, he heard something faint, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the plow itself. Lucas dismissed it as his imagination, but the unease lingered. His hand brushed against the carvings on the blade, and for a brief moment he felt a sharp prick. Not physical pain, but a deep, unsettling sensation, as if something had probed his thoughts. The unease only grew when he tried to move the plow. It was unnaturally heavy, resisting his every effort, almost as if it didn't want to leave its resting place. The harder he pulled, the louder the whispering became, until it filled the barn like a swarm of insects buzzing in his ears. Finally, with a final tug, the plow shifted, and the whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Lucas paused, his breath visible in the now icy air, his skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Outside the barn, the landscape had changed. The once dry fields appeared damp, glistening unnaturally under the dimming light. The smell of wet earth filled his nostrils, mingled with something else, something metallic and sharp like blood. His dog, Max, usually loyal and protective, stood at the edge of the barn, whining softly, his tail tucked between his legs. Lucas called out to him, but the dog wouldn't come closer, his gaze fixed on the plow with an almost human-like fear. As Lucas finally dragged the plow out into the open, the sun dipped below the horizon, and a dense fog began to creep over the fields, swallowing everything in its path. The world around him seemed to shift. The chirping of crickets and the distant calls of birds fell silent, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and for a fleeting moment, Lucas thought he saw figures moving in the mist, their shapes distorted and wrong. Suddenly, the plow emitted a faint hum, a vibration that traveled up his hands and into his chest. He dropped it instinctively, stumbling back, his heart pounding in his ears. For a brief second, he could have sworn he saw the runes glow faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed as though alive. Then, just as quickly as it began, the light vanished, and the plow lay still, innocent once more. But Lucas knew, deep in his bones he knew, that something had awakened, and it wasn't going to let him go so easily. The first night after Lucas unearthed the plow, his dreams turned dark and chaotic. He found himself standing in a vast, barren field under an endless, starless sky. The soil beneath his feet was black and wet, sticking to his boots like tar. In the distance, a figure loomed, cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by a hood. The figure held the plow, dragging it across the ground with an unnatural ease. As it moved, the earth split open behind it, revealing writhing roots that glistened with a crimson sheen. The air was filled with an overwhelming metallic scent, like freshly spilled blood. The figure stopped and turned its hooded head toward Lucas. Though no face was visible, Lucas felt an unbearable weight in its gaze, as if it were peeling back the layers of his mind. The figure raised a hand, and suddenly Lucas heard a voice, not with his ears, but deep within his skull. "You've touched what was never yours to find," it hissed, low and guttural, reverberating like an ancient curse. Before Lucas could move, the ground beneath him gave way, and he plunged into darkness. He woke up gasping, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was stifling, the air thick and heavy. At the edge of his bed, the faint outline of a figure seemed to linger for a moment before dissolving into the shadows. Lucas shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But as he wiped his face, he noticed something chilling. His hand was smeared with dirt, damp and black, the same as in his dream. Over the next few days, Lucas began to piece together fragments of his family's history, spurred by the unease that gnawed at him. While rummaging through the attic, he found an old trunk, its hinges rusted, and its surface covered in strange carvings similar to those on the plow. Inside, he discovered a bundle of letters wrapped in faded fabric. The handwriting was familiar, a delicate script that he recognized as his grandmother's. One letter caught his attention immediately. The ink was smudged, and the paper felt oddly warm to the touch, as if it had been written recently. It spoke of a family curse tied to the land, a warning passed down through generations. "The plow is not an instrument of growth," she wrote. "It is a gateway. Do not let it break the soil, or it will break you." The final lines chilled Lucas to his core. Our blood binds it. And it binds us. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. He was a child, no more than 6 years old, playing near the barn while his grandmother worked in the fields. She had always forbidden him from entering the barn alone, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. He remembered stepping inside, the air thick with the scent of old hay, and something else, something acrid and metallic. In the corner, beneath a tarp, he had glimpsed the plow. His fingers had brushed its surface, and he remembered crying out as a sharp pain seared his palm. His grandmother had rushed in, her face pale as a ghost. She had scolded him fiercely, then bound his hand without explanation, her eyes filled with fear rather than anger. The scar on his palm, long since faded, now throbbed as if freshly wounded. Lucas felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The plow had been waiting for him for decades, maybe longer. It wasn't a coincidence that he had found it now, in his moment of desperation. It was as if the thing had been calling to him all along, biding its time until he was vulnerable enough to use it. And now, the connection between them was undeniable. His family's blood had awakened something ancient and malevolent, and it would not rest until its purpose was fulfilled. The dreams intensified, each night more vivid and horrifying than the last. He saw flashes of a pact being made in the distant past, a man who looked strikingly like Lucas kneeling before the plow, his hands dripping with blood as he carved symbols into the ground. He heard the chants of a language he couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. Each morning, Lucas awoke with new scars, thin, jagged lines etched across his skin, matching the patterns on the plow's blade. Desperate for answers, Lucas returned to the barn, the place where it had all begun. The plow sat in the corner, untouched but not unchanged. The runes on its surface glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing like a heartbeat. As he approached, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and chaotic. They weren't just sounds, they were voices, fragmented and desperate. He strained to make out the words, but one phrase cut through the cacophony like a knife. "It's in your blood." Lucas's hands trembled as he backed away, his mind racing. He wasn't just dealing with a cursed object. He was tied to it, bound by something far older and darker than he could comprehend. And deep down, he knew there was no escaping it. The night the whispers grew louder, Lucas knew the plow wasn't finished with him. The once faint voices had become a constant presence, their fragmented words weaving a symphony of torment. He tried to block them out, to drown them with music or the hum of machinery, but they clawed their way back into his mind, relentless and sharp. The plow had become a fixture of his nightmares and his waking hours, as if it had rooted itself into the very fabric of his life. Every time he glanced at it, sitting ominously in the barn, it seemed closer, even though he hadn't touched it since that first day. That evening, as a blood-red moon rose over the horizon, Lucas noticed the fog returning, thicker than before. It clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around his legs as he walked toward the barn, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. Inside, the plow radiated an unnatural heat, and the runes on its blade glowed brighter than ever. The air crackled with energy, and Lucas felt a presence behind him, a shadow, tall and skeletal, that moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The shadow spoke, but its voice wasn't its own. It was a chorus of many, overlapping and discordant, yet chillingly clear. "The land demands a sacrifice," it said, its words reverberating through the barn. "You must choose." The barn seemed to expand, its walls stretching into darkness. Shapes began to emerge in the shadows, figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, their forms writhing in agony. They surrounded Lucas, their mouths moving in silent screams. Then one by one they spoke, their voices filled with despair. "We chose wrong," they murmured, their voices barely above a whisper. "Don't make our mistake." Lucas backed away, his heart pounding, but the shadow blocked his escape. In its outstretched hand, he saw something familiar, a small wooden box that had belonged to his mother. She had always kept it locked, its contents a mystery. Now the shadow offered it to him, opening the lid to reveal a faded photograph of Lucas as a child, cradled in his mother's arms. The sight filled him with a deep, aching sadness and dread. The shadow's voice returned, colder this time. "The plow will take what it is owed," it said. You can offer it your past, your bloodline, or your sanity. Decide, or the land will wither, and so will you. Lucas felt the weight of the ultimatum crush him. If he sacrificed his past, the memories of his mother, his anchor during the darkest times, would vanish. Every laugh, every embrace, every word of wisdom would be erased, leaving him hollow. If he chose his bloodline, the curse would fall on someone else, perhaps a child he hadn't yet conceived, or a relative he had never met. The thought twisted his stomach. And if he offered his sanity, he feared what might remain of him, if anything. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a vortex. The shadow leaned closer, its skeletal face now visible. Its hollow sockets seemed to devour the light, and its mouth twisted into a cruel semblance of a smile. Tick-tock, it hissed, the sound echoing like a clock counting down. Choose. Lucas fell to his knees, the photograph clutched tightly in his trembling hands. His mind raced, his thoughts unraveling as the whispers grew deafening. Visions of his mother's face, of children he might never meet, and of himself, broken and empty, flashed before him. The figures in the shadows began to chant, their voices rising in a mournful crescendo. The barn walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the plow glowed so brightly it lit the entire space in a sickly green hue. Tears streamed down Lucas's face as he screamed into the void. "Why me? What do you want from me?" His voice cracked, desperation bleeding into every word. The shadow reached out, its cold, bony fingers brushing against Lucas's cheek. "You were chosen long before you were born," it said, almost tenderly. "This was always your fate. Now fulfill it." Lucas's chest heaved as he looked at the photograph again, his mother's warm smile piercing through the darkness. He thought of the sacrifices she had made for him, the love she had given freely. Could he really erase her memory for the sake of his survival? His hands shook violently as he closed his eyes, searching for an answer in the chaos. When he opened them, the photograph had begun to fade, the edges curling and turning to ash. Time was running out. Lucas's mind was a storm of anguish, each option more horrifying than the last. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed the whispers, he made his choice. The shadow loomed over him, its hollow sockets gleaming with triumph. The barn trembled as the plow shuddered violently, its glow intensifying until the light consumed everything. The figures in the shadows let out an ear-splitting wail as they dissolved into the fog, their voices mingling with Lucas's final, anguished cry. And then silence. The air in the barn grew dense, suffocating, as Lucas sat trembling in the corner, his choice still haunting him. The plow lay silent, its runes dimmed but not extinguished, as if resting, waiting. Lucas had hoped that making the sacrifice would end his torment, but the whispers had only grown more vivid, more insidious. They no longer echoed in his mind. They had taken form, becoming voices that crawled out from the darkest corners of his home, filling the silence with an unbearable sense of dread. It started small. At night, the faint murmur of voices would rise from beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. He tried to convince himself it was the house settling or the wind playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew better. The voices were growing bolder. They didn't stay confined to the barn anymore. They followed him. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements unnatural, stuttering like broken marionettes. The whispers spoke his name, softly at first, then louder, their tone a mixture of pleading and mockery. "Lucas, come back to us. You belong with us." One night, the voices led him to the fields. He stood under the pale light of the moon, the once thriving crops now twisted and gnarled, their roots exposed like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The earth beneath his feet seemed to breathe, shifting subtly, as though something massive stirred just below the surface. The whispers surrounded him, circling like a predator toying with its prey. "Dig, Lucas," they urged, their tone dripping with malevolence. "It's all waiting for you, beneath." In the center of the field, Lucas noticed something strange, a patch of soil darker than the rest, as if it had been scorched. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, making him gag, but he couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "It's here, Lucas. Dig. Find the truth." Against his better judgment, he grabbed a shovel from the shed and began to dig. Each thrust of the blade met with an unsettling squelch, as if the earth were alive. As he dug deeper, the soil became slick and black, staining his hands and arms like ink. The deeper he went, the more the whispers changed. They no longer coaxed him. They mocked him, their voices filled with glee. "Foolish boy, you think you can escape us? We've been here all along." Suddenly, the blade of the shovel struck something hard. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands until he unearthed an object. A wooden box, its surface carved with the same runes as the plow. Lucas hesitated, his breath shallow as the whispers reached a fever pitch. "Open it, Lucas. You must." His hands trembled as he pried the lid open, revealing a mass of decayed roots intertwined with human bones. At the center of the box lay a single, withered heart, its surface pulsating weakly, as though still alive. A scream caught in Lucas's throat as the air around him shifted. The ground beneath him began to ripple, and from the soil erupted hands, decayed, skeletal hands that clawed at his legs, pulling him toward the dark patch of earth. Lucas fought against the pull, his screams echoing across the empty fields. The whispers had become deafening now, a cacophony of voices shrieking, laughing, and crying all at once. "You brought this upon yourself, Lucas. You belong to the soil." Desperate, he grabbed the box and hurled it into the pit, the withered heart bouncing free and rolling into the darkness. For a moment, everything stopped. The hands released him, the ground fell still, and the whispers silenced. But then came the laughter. Low and guttural at first, it grew louder, more menacing, until it felt like the entire world was laughing at him. The soil erupted in a geyser of black sludge, and from it emerged a figure, a twisted amalgamation of roots and flesh, its form human-like but grotesque. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its gaping maw stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The whispers returned, now emanating from the creature itself. "Did you think you could bury the past? Did you think it would let you go?" Lucas stumbled backward, his heart pounding as the creature began to advance. Every step it took caused the ground to tremble, and the air around it seemed to warp, distorting reality. Shadows writhed and twisted, reaching for him like living entities. The creature extended a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and ending in razor-sharp claws. "You are ours, Lucas," it rasped. "You always have been." Lucas ran, his lungs burning as he sprinted back to the house. But even inside, he found no sanctuary. The shadows had followed him, creeping along the walls, their whispers now accompanied by faint, ghostly laughter. Every mirror in the house reflected not his own image, but that of the creature, its hollow eyes staring back at him, its grin widening with every passing moment. In his panic, Lucas locked himself in the bedroom, barricading the door with furniture. He sat in the corner, clutching his knees as the whispers surrounded him, louder and closer than ever. From under the door, black tendrils of shadow seeped into the room, crawling toward him. The creature's voice echoed in his mind, low and mocking. "You cannot hide from us, Lucas. The soil hungers. The plow demands." As the tendrils reached his feet, Lucas let out a guttural scream, the terror consuming him whole. The shadows enveloped him, their cold embrace suffocating and relentless. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of the plow, its blades scraping against the earth, carving runes into the soil as the whispers promised. This is just the beginning. Lucas woke to an eerie stillness, the kind that sets the heart racing without explanation. The whispers were gone, but their absence felt like a prelude to something worse. Outside, the world seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating silence that pressed against his ears like static. As he stepped outside, the fog returned, thicker than ever, rolling across the fields in slow, deliberate waves. It wasn't random anymore. It moved with intent, coiling around the house as if to keep him contained. The land itself seemed to breathe beneath his feet, each step sinking into damp soil that clung to his boots like tar. That's when the visions began. At first, they came in flashes, split-second images that flickered in his periphery like a stuttering film reel. He saw himself standing in the field, holding the plow, his face contorted in an expression he didn't recognize. He wasn't himself in those glimpses, his eyes were hollow, his movements mechanical. Then came the laughter, low, guttural, rising from the soil around him. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but felt deep in the bones, as if the land itself were mocking his struggle. The visions grew stronger as Lucas stumbled through the fog. He saw the house engulfed in flames, the fields rotting to ash, and the faces of loved ones staring back at him from the shadows, their expressions frozen in anguish. His mother's voice echoed through the mist, calling his name, but it wasn't a plea for help, it was a warning. "You're feeding it, Lucas. Stop before it takes everything." Lucas clenched his fists, trying to ground himself, but the land wouldn't let him escape. The soil beneath him rippled like water, and he felt himself sinking, the ground pulling at his legs with a strength that defied reason. The whispers returned, not from the shadows this time, but from within his own mind. "You've seen it, Lucas. You know what you must do. This is who you are." As he fought to break free, the fog parted, revealing the plow, sitting in the field where he had left it. Only it wasn't just a tool anymore. Its wooden beams and metal blades pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the runes carved into its surface shifted and writhed like worms. The plow seemed to breathe, each exhale releasing a black mist that seeped into the ground. Around it, the crops had grown wild, unnaturally large, their stalks twisted and coiled together like a living organism. The whispers began to tempt him, their tones shifting from mockery to seduction. "Look at what you've created, Lucas. The land thrives because of you. The power is yours. All you have to do is embrace it." The visions returned, this time showing him a version of his farm untouched by rot or decay. The crops were abundant, the house restored to its former glory, and Lucas stood at the center of it all, revered and invincible. But even in this idyllic scene, something felt wrong. The shadows lingered at the edges, watching, waiting. Lucas shook his head, trying to dispel the images, but the whispers persisted. They began to unearth his deepest fears, dredging them up like corpses from a forgotten grave. He saw himself alone, the farm consumed by rot, his body twisted and broken, nothing more than a vessel for the darkness that had claimed him. He heard his mother's voice again, not calling to him this time, but crying out in pain. "You let it take me, Lucas. You let it in." The visions escalated, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. Lucas found himself standing in front of the plow, without realizing how he had gotten there. Its glow was mesmerizing now, the runes pulsating in time with his own heartbeat. The whispers became a single, unified voice, calm and commanding. "This is your destiny, Lucas. The land answers to you. You have the power to shape it, or to destroy it, but you must choose." The temptation was overwhelming. He felt the power radiating from the plow, a dark, seductive force that promised everything he had ever wanted: abundance, control, freedom from fear. But it came with a price, one he didn't fully understand but could feel in his bones. The air around him grew colder, the fog pressing against his skin like a living thing. He looked down at his hands and saw the runes etched into his flesh, glowing faintly, as if they had been there all along. Then, the laughter returned, louder and more menacing. The shadows that had watched from the edges began to move, crawling toward him with unnatural speed. Their shapes were distorted, their faces grotesque masks of agony and malice. The fog thickened, wrapping around Lucas like chains, pulling him closer to the plow. His mind raced as the voice grew louder, drowning out his own thoughts. "Take it, Lucas. Accept what you are." In a final act of defiance, Lucas turned away, his body trembling with the effort. The whispers roared in fury, the shadows lunging at him. But he ran, stumbling through the fog back toward the house. Behind him, the plow's glow intensified, lighting up the field in a sickly green hue. The land beneath him quaked, and the shadows pursued him relentlessly, their forms shifting and contorting as they closed the distance. Reaching the house, Lucas slammed the door shut, his chest heaving as he pressed his back against it. The whispers had faded, replaced by a deafening silence, but he knew this was only a reprieve. The plow had shown him its power, its promise, and its curse. The temptation still lingered, a seed planted deep within his mind, growing with every passing moment. And outside, in the fog-covered field, the plow waited. It knew he would return. The night was pitch black, as if the stars themselves had fled, leaving Lucas alone beneath an oppressive, suffocating sky. The house was silent, too silent, its creaking floors and whispering walls replaced by a foreboding stillness. He sat in the living room, staring at his trembling hands. They were stained, not with dirt or blood, but with a faint glow. Runes, identical to those on the plow, had begun to etch themselves into his skin. The lines pulsated with a rhythmic light, as if sinking to the beating of his heart. He had avoided the fields for days, but deep down he knew it was futile. The plow was calling him, and tonight there would be no escape. A sudden knock shattered the silence. It wasn't at the door, it came from below, deep within the earth. It was deliberate, slow, and impossibly loud, reverberating through the house. Lucas stood, his legs weak beneath him, and before he could think to resist, his feet carried him toward the barn. The whispers returned, louder than ever, rising in an overwhelming cacophony that filled his mind with images of fire, rot, and endless darkness. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself sought to drag him down. As he pushed open the barn doors, the air inside hit him like a wave, thick with the stench of decay and damp earth. The plow sat in the center, its glow now blinding, bathing the barn in a sickly green light. The runes on its surface shifted and danced, forming words in a language Lucas couldn't understand, but somehow felt in his very bones. The whispers unified into a single voice, low, commanding, and inescapable. It's time, Lucas. The soil has chosen. Fulfill your purpose. The ground beneath the plow began to crack, splitting open like a gaping wound. From the fissure rose thick black roots, writhing like serpents, their surfaces glistening with a strange, viscous liquid. The roots spread across the barn floor, reaching toward Lucas. He tried to back away, but his body betrayed him. His legs wouldn't move, as if they had been claimed by the same force emanating from the plow. The voice spoke again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. You are bound to the soil, Lucas. Your blood, your memories, your very soul, all belong to us. Do not resist. Lucas clenched his fists, his breath ragged as he fought against the terror gripping him. Why me? He shouted, his voice cracking. What do you want from me? The light from the plow dimmed momentarily, and in its place, a figure began to take shape. It was human-like, but grotesquely twisted, its body composed of roots, soil, and bone. Its face was a void, a black pit that seemed to draw in all light. You were marked long before your birth, it said, its voice like gravel grinding against metal. Your family's pact binds you. This land thrives on sacrifice, and you are the final offering. The figure raised a hand, and the runes on Lucas's skin flared, burning with an intensity that brought him to his knees. Images flooded his mind, generations of his family, each one bound to the land, their lives feeding the plow's insatiable hunger. He saw his mother, standing before the plow, her hands trembling as she whispered a prayer. He saw her crying, her back turned as she buried something beneath the field. And then he saw himself, a child, standing near the barn, his small hand brushing against the plow's blade for the first time. That moment had sealed his fate. The creature's voice softened, almost coaxing. You can end this, Lucas. Take the plow. Harness its power. Sacrifice your past, your pain, and become one with the land. You will never feel fear again. Lucas's mind raced. The temptation was strong, an end to the whispers, the visions, the torment. But at what cost? He looked at the plow, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat, and felt the darkness within it pulling at him. The runes on his skin had spread, creeping up his arms, glowing brighter with every passing second. The whispers became deafening, their words blurring into a single, urgent chant. Take it. Take it. Take it. But something deep inside him refused. He remembered his mother's warnings, her tears, and the fear in her eyes. He remembered the letter he had found, her desperate plea to break the cycle. Lucas gritted his teeth and screamed. No. The barn erupted in chaos. The roots lashed out, smashing through walls and wrapping around Lucas's legs, pulling him toward the plow. The creature let out a guttural roar, its form shifting and contorting as it loomed over him. You cannot defy us, it bellowed. The soil will consume you. Lucas reached into his pocket, pulling out the letter he had carried with him since that night. The words written by his mother burned into his mind. With trembling hands, he tore the letter, scattering the pieces across the barn floor. The runes on his skin flared violently, the light clashing with the darkness emanating from the plow. The creature howled, its form dissolving as the light consumed it. The plow shook violently, its glow flickering as cracks formed along its surface. Lucas felt the roots release him, retreating back into the fissure. The ground began to collapse, swallowing the plow along with the barn. He barely made it out, diving into the field as the entire structure was consumed in a deafening roar. When the dust settled, the barn was gone, and the plow with it. Lucas sat in the field, his body trembling, his mind reeling from what he had just endured. The whispers were gone, but the silence they left behind felt just as haunting. The runes on his skin faded, leaving faint scars, a reminder of the price he had paid. He looked out over the field, now barren and lifeless. The land was quiet, but Lucas knew it wasn't over. The plow may have been buried, but the soil still held its secrets. And deep beneath the earth, something still waited. The night after the barn collapsed, Lucas thought he could finally rest. The plow was gone, the whispers had faded, and the air around the farm felt lighter. But deep down, a gnawing unease lingered, a sense that the plow's malevolence had not been entirely extinguished. The land was too quiet, too still, as though holding its breath. Shadows clung to the corners of his vision, flickering and shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As midnight approached, Lucas was startled awake by a deafening crack, like thunder erupting from beneath the earth. The entire house shuddered, and he scrambled to his feet, the walls groaning as if they were alive. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from below. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards, and the faint, all too familiar whispers returned, rising like a tide. They were different now, more guttural, filled with rage. You cannot escape us, Lucas. We are the soil. We are eternal. His breath caught as the ground beneath his living room split open, the wooden planks splintering and falling into a black abyss. From the darkness emerged thick, gnarled roots, dripping with a viscous black liquid that hissed as it touched the air. The roots spread quickly, crawling up the walls, cracking windows, and snuffing out the lights. In the glow of the moonlight streaming through the broken panes, Lucas saw something rise from the chasm. It was the plow, but it wasn't the same. It had fused with the darkness, its wood and metal twisted and warped into something grotesque. The runes etched into its surface burned brighter than ever, pulsating like a living thing. And behind it, a figure emerged, taller and more terrifying than the one he had seen before. Its body was a mass of writhing roots, its face a hollow void, with glowing runes etched into its chest. The plow floated before it, tethered by dark tendrils that pulsed with life. The creature's voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the house. "Did you think you could destroy me, Lucas? I am bound to this land. To you. Your bloodline feeds me. Your sacrifice has only made me stronger." Lucas backed away, his heart pounding, but there was nowhere to run. The roots had sealed the doors and windows, encasing the house in a cage of living darkness. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that clawed at his sanity. He covered his ears, but it did no good. The voices were inside his head, taunting him, breaking him down. "This is your destiny, Lucas. You cannot fight the soil." The creature raised a hand, and the plow lurched forward, its blade gleaming with a sickly green light. Lucas barely dodged as it slammed into the wall behind him, splintering wood and leaving deep gouges. The plow moved on its own, a malevolent force guided by the creature's will. It slashed at him again and again, forcing him to retreat deeper into the house. He grabbed a broken piece of wood from the shattered furniture, but it was useless. The plow was relentless, its movements precise and unyielding. Desperation clawed at Lucas's mind as he stumbled into his mother's old room. He slammed the door shut, but the roots began to crawl through the cracks, tearing it apart. In the corner of the room, he saw the wooden box he had found in the barn. The fragments of his mother's letter were scattered around it, but one piece caught his eye. A single line he hadn't noticed before, written in smudged ink. "The soil can be cleansed, but only with fire." The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. Fire. The one force the soil couldn't claim, the one element that could purify what had been corrupted. Lucas's gaze darted around the room until he found an old lantern, still filled with oil. He grabbed it and held it tightly as the roots burst through the door, the creature and the plow looming in the doorway. The creature laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "You think fire can stop me? This land has consumed generations of your kind. You are nothing but ash waiting to happen." Lucas ignored the taunts, focusing on the lantern. His hands shook as he lit the wick, the small flame flickering to life. The creature recoiled slightly, its hollow face twisting in what Lucas could only describe as anger. "You will burn with it," it roared, sending the plow hurtling toward him. In a single motion, Lucas hurled the lantern at the plow. The glass shattered on impact, and the oil erupted into flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the plow and the roots surrounding it. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream, its body writhing as the flames licked at its form. The runes on its chest dimmed, flickering like dying embers. "No, this is not the end," it bellowed, its voice cracking with rage and desperation. The fire spread rapidly, devouring the roots and creeping toward the walls. Lucas stumbled out of the room, the heat searing his skin as he fought to stay ahead of the flames. The house groaned and buckled, the creature's screams echoing in the chaos. The whispers had turned into wails, their tone no longer mocking but pleading. "Don't leave us, Lucas. You are one of us." As the fire consumed the last of the roots, the creature collapsed into the chasm beneath the house, dragging the plow with it. The runes on Lucas's skin burned one final time before fading completely, leaving behind nothing but faint scars. He stumbled out of the house just as it collapsed in on itself, the flames reaching high into the night sky. Lucas fell to his knees in the field, his chest heaving as he watched the fire burn. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost peaceful. But as he stared into the flames, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The land was quiet now, but it wasn't gone. It had retreated, waiting, biding its time. And deep in the smoldering ruins, beneath the charred remains of the house, something still pulsed faintly in the ashes. A single rune, glowing weakly, like a heartbeat refusing to die. The morning after the fire, the farm was unrecognizable. The once vibrant fields were nothing more than ashen wastelands, their charred remnants stretching out like a desolate canvas. Smoke curled lazily into the sky, and the acrid scent of burned wood and soil lingered in the air. Lucas stood in the middle of it all, his body trembling from exhaustion, his mind a storm of fear and disbelief. He had survived, but at what cost? The whispers were gone, the creature defeated, or so he hoped. But the weight of the silence felt heavier than the chaos it had replaced, as if the land itself were watching, waiting for something. As he surveyed the ruins of his home, Lucas's gaze was drawn to the spot where the barn had once stood. The fire had consumed nearly everything, yet the ground there was untouched. The soil was black, but not from ash. It was wet, slick, and pulsing faintly as if alive. He felt an overwhelming urge to approach, but every instinct screamed for him to stay away. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the viscous earth. In the center of the patch, something gleamed, a fragment of metal, half buried in the soil. It was unmistakable, a shard of the plow's blade, its surface still etched with glowing runes. Lucas's breath hitched. He had watched the plow burn, seen it dragged into the depths of the creature's chasm. Yet here it was, a piece of it still alive, still defiant. The runes pulsed faintly, almost as if they were breathing, and a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the air. Lucas knelt cautiously, reaching out to touch the shard. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a shock rippled through him, and the world around him shifted. The sky darkened, and the air grew thick with the scent of rot and damp earth. Shadows began to move at the edges of his vision, growing longer, more defined. He pulled his hand back, his heart racing, but the shadows didn't retreat. They crept closer, forming shapes, figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a faint, raspy whisper. "You think it's over, Lucas? The soil never forgets. It never forgives." Lucas stumbled backward, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure stretched a hand toward him, its bony fingers curling as if to grasp him. More voices joined the first, overlapping in a mournful chorus. "We were here before you. We will be here after you. You cannot break the cycle." Desperate to escape, Lucas turned and ran, his feet slipping in the wet soil as the voices rose behind him. He reached the edge of the field, where the land transitioned to untouched forest, but even here, the shadows seemed to follow. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches creaking like whispers, their leaves blackened and brittle. Lucas fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers returned, not from outside but from within. They spoke of hunger, of sacrifice, of his bloodline's eternal debt to the land. Then the world fell silent. When Lucas opened his eyes, he was back in the field. The shadows were gone, the figures erased as if they had never existed. But the shard of the plow was still there, its runes glowing brighter now, as if mocking his attempts to escape. Lucas realized with chilling clarity that the land was not done with him. The fire, the creature, the destruction of the plow, it had all been a temporary reprieve. The soil's hunger was insatiable, and it would always find a way to feed. Over the following days, Lucas tried to leave the farm. He packed his belongings, what little he had left, and set out on the road. But no matter how far he traveled, he always found himself back at the edge of the fields, the blackened land stretching out before him like a scar. The farm wouldn't let him go. It was as if the soil had tethered itself to his very soul, binding him to the cursed land. One night, as he sat in the ruins of his house, the whispers returned. They were softer this time, almost comforting, as if lulling him into a false sense of security. "You cannot escape us, Lucas," they murmured. "You are one of us now. The soil has chosen you." The shadows began to creep again, weaving through the cracks in the walls, pooling at his feet. This time he didn't run. He couldn't. The exhaustion, the despair, the weight of what he had lost, it was too much. As the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into their cold embrace, he heard one final whisper, quiet and triumphant. "You belong to the soil. Forever." When morning came, the farm was empty. The ruins of the house stood untouched, the fields barren and lifeless. But in the center of the blackened patch where the barn had been, the shard of the plow remained, glowing faintly, its runes pulsing like a heartbeat. And deep beneath the earth, the soil stirred, waiting for the next to come.